It is a Star Wars show, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out another episode. Remember that if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the alarm button so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying this on whichever podcast platform you happen to be enjoying the show on, be sure to subscribe on that platform. Let's go ahead and get started here with some news that dropped ahead of the debut of Skeleton Crew, and we'll talk a little bit further about this later on in the episode.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So for whatever reason, and I wonder whether or not this is the plan all along, when they do this, they just simply wait until the last minute to give the actual date that they are deciding to go and release the episode. Initially, Skeleton Crew, the latest series from a galaxy far, far away, releasing on Disney+, was to be coming out on Tuesday, December 3rd. Tuesdays will be its official release date subsequently after its debut. Now, the 8-part show, led by Jude Law, is premiering its first 2 episodes on December 2nd at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Again, subsequent episodes will then release on Tuesdays at the same time for the rest of the season. So no reason for this announcement, and it happens quite often, which makes me think that this is just a part of the marketing. That this is just to go and hype up the show one last time before it gets released. They're not putting out anything further in terms of trailers that will promote the show. You do get some TV spots and posts on social media, but when they go and make an announcement like this, suddenly shows like mine and those that are much more popular than a Star Wars show with Jon Justice end up going and producing videos to let everybody know, hey, you get to watch Skeleton Crew early. So I tend to think that this is nothing more than marketing shenanigans. Nonetheless, I'll be able to watch it on Tuesday instead of Wednesday, since my Monday through Friday job puts me in bed far too early to watch the show on the night that it's released. And while in years past I would get up earlier than I typically do, than 2:30 in the morning to watch, say, The Mandalorian, I now have older sons in the house who ask to watch these shows with their dad. And so I respect that, and Star Wars is about family. So I will be watching Skeleton Crew on Tuesday afternoon, and I will certainly be sharing my thoughts on the first 2 episodes on next week's A Star Wars Show with Jon Justice. I am very much looking forward to it, and I'll have further thoughts on Skeleton Crew a little bit later on in this week's episode.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
In an article from The Hollywood Reporter, Deni Villeneuve explains his Star Wars disinterest. The Dune director opens up about why he does not want to direct a Star Wars movie. I have become a huge fan of Deni Villeneuve, going back to Sicario, The Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, and of course the Dune movies. He is one of my favorite directors. Whether or not he would be a good fit for Star Wars, I'm not so sure in his directing style, and certainly the popcorn films and adventure films that Star Wars tends to be. I think it could be a situation where we get a Deni Villeneuve Star Wars film as opposed to a Star Wars film. I would certainly watch it. I would probably enjoy it. But in terms of mass consumption, I wonder if whether or not he would have been a great pick. I will say, add one more thing before I get into the article and why the director does not want to do a Star Wars movie. And it's a sentiment that I kind of agree with. His ability to create and direct action sequences are unparalleled. The action sequences in the Dune films, in Sicario, even in Blade Runner, I mean, there's an emotional weight and depth to his filmmaking, where his films tend to be a little bit slower paced, which is why I question whether or not he would be a good fit for Star Wars. It doesn't really matter. He's not going to do one. But his action sequences, that I would absolutely pay to see. Him put together a Star Wars battle. So let's get into this article here. The Dune filmmaker says he fell out of love with the franchise a rather long time ago. While on the Town podcast, Villeneuve shared that Star Wars blew it after 2 films, with 1983's Return of the Jedi, which most fans considered to be a step down from 1977's A New Hope and 1980's Empire Strikes Back. And what I've noticed is there is a generation of Star Wars fans. So I'm 52, and there's a generation of Star Wars fans just barely behind me in age. By maybe, I don't want to go so far as to say 10 years, but, between 5 and 10 years, to which they discovered Star Wars on Return of the Jedi, and it's their favorite Star Wars film. And there's a phenomenon among, film watchers, cinephiles, where, and I tend to be this way, we like the newest thing. Not with everybody, but there is a phenomenon within pop culture and fandom where they like the newest thing. And for Return of the Jedi, that was the newest thing for them. The other 2 films were slightly older, whereas I was weaned on A New Hope. Now, there's also something very interesting relating to that slightly younger generation than me and their affinity for Return of the Jedi in how Deni Villeneuve lost his love of Star Wars because of that film, and I'll get into this further. But he said, I was the target audience. I was 10 years old. It went to my brain like a silver bullet. I became obsessed with Star Wars, he said. I mean, The Empire Strikes Back is a movie that I anticipated my own life. So Deni Villeneuve's about 5 years older than I am. I saw it 1 billion times on screen. I was traumatized by The Empire Strikes Back. I adore Star Wars. The problem is that it all derailed in the 1983 film Return of the Jedi. It's a long story. I was 15 years old, and my best friend and I wanted to take a cab and go to L.A. and talk to George Lucas. We were so angry. Still today, the Ewoks. It turned out to be a comedy for kids. Star Wars became crystallized in its own mythology, very dogmatic. It seemed like a recipe, no more surprises. And so I'm not dreaming to do a Star Wars because it feels like a code that is very codified. As far as Star Trek goes, Villeneuve admitted, I'm not a Trekkie, which is interesting because Deni Villeneuve's directing style would actually lend itself quite well to a certain style, and probably the most popular style of Star Trek films, as they're paced a little bit slower, whereas I enjoy the J.J. Abrams and Kelvin era, more recent era of Star Trek films. I may have said Star Wars there a moment ago. Star Trek films, where a lot of people, do not like them because they're too much like Star Wars. The Oscar-nominated director seemed reluctant to talk about a potential Dune 3 film and simply said he might be doing it. Elsewhere, he said he'd prefer to return to unique films rather than dive into another franchise. And Deni Villeneuve has said that he wants to do Dune Messiah, but that he would do something dramatically different than what the Messiah book, which gets very strange for Frank Herbert, does. And I hope he does, because I think that Dune 1 and 2 are absolute masterpieces. And while they do tell a cohesive story, there is, of course, this Empire Strikes Back-esque ending to part 2 of the Dune series. And I would love to see that fleshed out with a final film in that trilogy. But this gets into kind of what I wanted to talk about for the content this week before I get to your emails.
This is not going to go the way you think.
Now, none of this is relevant anymore. I'll just be upfront, considering that George Lucas is no longer a part of Star Wars. However, I did want to raise the question of whether or not George Lucas should have been more aware of the connectivity of his serialized storytelling over multiple films and have adjusted the more childlike aspects of the later films. Star Wars, the original, A New Hope, didn't have much in the way as it relates to childish whimsy. Empire Strikes Back even less so. But then we land on Return of the Jedi, and we get the lofty-neck musical sequence at the beginning in Jabba's palace, lackluster dialogue moments, C-3PO's, here we go again, Han Solo's overly sarcastic sort of, you're gonna need it. And, of course, you get the Ewoks. And I empathize with Deni's view on this. The finale of The Phantom Menace suffers, for me, much in the same way that the finale does of Return of the Jedi. You have an intense face-to-face confrontation taking place. Lightsabers, right? Lightsabers clashing, lightsaber battles, and certainly the deep resonance of what takes place between Vader, Luke, and the Emperor at the end of Return of the Jedi. This is cutting between an intense space battle in both of these films, and that is, of course, cut in between a ground battle that kind of gets ridiculous at times, with Jar Jar's big adventure in The Phantom Menace and the Ewoks as seemingly being able to kill stormtroopers with a single slingshot and stick smacks off their helmets. The Phantom Menace leans into the kiddos with Jar Jar almost exclusively, poop jokes that are included. And listen, that makes some sense for those adults who've now had children and are exposing themselves, their families to Star Wars. But you're also, kind of insulting a little bit of the adult audience that is there to see a more adult Star Wars because they've grown up. Now, George went and course-corrected through Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, so wherein Return of the Jedi took a big step backwards toward the fantasy and childish elements. Now, again, these are all films that I watch. Return of the Jedi is the Star Wars film that I actually watch the least. It's one of the few where I put it on and I kind of tune out, or I get on my phone if I do, or I put it on in the background. Whereas if I watch the original trilogy, Empire Strikes Back and A New Hope, I'm locked into those films. And this goes back to that generation just behind me, who were exposed to Return of the Jedi as their first Star Wars film, in which case it actually goes and lends into that nostalgia factor, because it was more catered to a younger audience. But it was a step backwards for those that were beginning to grow into adolescence, as I was 10, 11, 12, and 13. And I remember that my love of Star Wars was waning as I got older, moved into being a teenager, and found girls. Now, all of this, and again, this isn't a rip on any of those films. I'm just pointing out this dynamic and that which Deni Villeneuve is pointing to as to why he doesn't want to make a Star Wars film, because he feels like he has to stick to a certain code. And he's right. I mean, look at the number of directors and content creators that are currently attempting to go and create Star Wars content and yet are dropping out of projects, because I think a big reason being that they've not been able to crack the code that people need to go and abide by. Now, all of this makes me wonder what Skeleton Crew is attempting to accomplish. I'm really looking forward to the show. Don't misunderstand. But it's easy to go back to the 80s, right? Goonies references relating to this show. More recently, I just finished up with a full four-season rewatch of Stranger Things. So, however, both of those examples that I just gave of going back to the 80s and Goonies, they have an advantage that Skeleton Crew cannot take advantage of. And that is either being made in the 80s, where they are nostalgia fuel for individuals like myself, or being set in the 80s, where you get the nostalgic references. Now, Skeleton Crew blatantly, and to its credit, used a Huttese vocal version of the 80s song Major Tom in the main trailer for the show. But there just isn't a rational way to inject that into the world of Star Wars storytelling and have it sort of make any sense. It may work well for a trailer, but it's going to take you completely out of the show if they were to go and do that. So with the creators being able to tap into that vibe, are they going to be able to? Goonies came out as a kid's film that we grew up loving and watching as adults because, again, of the nostalgia fuel that it provides. Will Skeleton Crew be relatable for adults who they're going to need for the show to be successful? I suppose we'll all find out on Monday night.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, your emails this week, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Friend of the show, Severin writes, pretty sure my 3-year-old won't care in the slightest what Star Wars does in the future, as long as it aligns with my beliefs and stays appropriate. I'll let her watch all of it when she's older. A few weeks ago, she got a tiny taste of The Rise of Skywalker, and ever since, she's been asking to watch more Starbucks. Kids are watching, and will keep watching. It takes so little to create absolute magic for a child. It's us adults who get hung up on details or get personally offended by a character's choices and storyline direction. Kids don't care. They have zero agenda. That's why I had no issues with the prequels. I watched them in tandem with the originals growing up, so I never had a chance to form one opinion, become stale with it, and then hate anything new or different years later. I do hope we see lots of Rey development, by the way. She is a great character with tons of potential, in my opinion. I completely agree with you, Severin, and thanks for the feedback this week. Star Wars Santa says, I've been reading Fate of the Jedi, the series from Legends. I think they could do a new trilogy with the same basic premise. The galaxy doesn't trust Force users and want to constrain them from acting without oversight from the new government. Introduce a threat that requires Jedi intervention, but have the problem of government constraints preventing them from acting effectively. There's a threat, there's tension, there's good versus evil. You could have plenty of younger Jedi and Padawan in the trilogy, with Rey and Finn in a leadership role. Yeah, that would absolutely work for me, Star Wars Santa. And lastly, N Black 1948 writes this. So Rey gets another trilogy, Luke didn't get 2. Well, I don't think it's a competition, necessarily, right? I understand your frustration, but it's not like you have to meet a quota. I hope and pray that if they do use Rey, it's in a far diminished role. If it's centered around her, I'm checking out altogether. I do think you're wrong about the amount of young fans. Of course, there are some, but I believe it's not enough to carry the franchise going forward. They need Gilroy in the worst way. If Andor Season 2 delivers, the legend of Gilroy will keep growing. And there will start to be more people for calling for him to take over. He's the best writer ever for Star Wars. And again, keeping this on a subjective level, right, because we're all entitled to our opinion, I completely disagree with that sentiment. Tony Gilroy is a fantastic writer, did a great job on Andor, but Andor is very specific, adult-centered Star Wars. And you need somebody who actually kind of knows Star Wars better than Tony Gilroy does in order to guide this franchise moving forward. I think he's good for what he does for Star Wars, but I do feel that your Dave Filoni and your Jon Favreau are certainly better suited to guide things moving forward, or perhaps there is another person out there that could fit the Feige role who is a lifelong fan of Star Wars, but also understands where its roots lie. Tony Gilroy was very open about saying that he didn't know anything about Star Wars when he stepped in to go work on Rogue One, and I think that benefited that film. I think he's probably grown to learn more of the lore of Star Wars, but there's something to be said of an individual who initially came into Star Wars not being a fan of it at all. Not to say they couldn't, I just think Tony Gilroy doesn't fit the bill of what Star Wars needs on a cinematic level to tell a larger Star Wars story, something more akin to what we experienced back when, with the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and yes, also the sequel trilogy. But I always appreciate your comments, and thanks for writing in this week. Listen, that wraps up this week's episode. Thank you so much for checking out a Star Wars show, and I hope if you enjoy listening to audiobooks or reading science fiction that you will support my podcast here and check out my science fiction adventure series, EMBARK. It is a fast-paced, action-packed, epic sci-fi saga written for adults, but age-appropriate for those 11 plus. 7 books in all in the series, available in hardcover, paperback, audiobook, free on Kindle Unlimited, and ebook as well. Book 1 in the series is as follows. Taft has found something, and humanity won't survive without it. When ship mechanic Taft Guardia agrees to help starfighter pilot Kate Amaro investigate a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father, they embark on a perilous journey of discovery amid a looming planet-wide industrial catastrophe. In the middle of a global evacuation, 2 rival megacorporations are on the brink of interstellar war, as Taft and Katha and their ragtag crew discover what may be the only hope of saving Earth's evacuees from annihilation. Listen, if you enjoy reading and listening to science fiction, you love Star Wars, you'll love my series, EMBARK. Filled with romance, action, it's epic, available on Amazon.com. Just search for EMBARK, E-M-B-A-R-K, and Jon, Jon Justice, and you can find it there. Thank you so much for checking out another episode. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel. And for those that are listening on the podcast, there is a full video version of this available on my YouTube page. Just search at Jon Justice, Jon on YouTube, at Jon Justice on YouTube, and you can find my channel there. Happy Thanksgiving. And wherever you are, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, and I hope you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.